All right, welcome to the 19th workshop in the Return to Freud. This is an ongoing workshop which explores the original papers written by Freud from the start of his career. Right now we're in the year 1912. So feel free to acquaint yourself with the previous workshops if you're new to this series. And without further ado, I'll start the presentations for the papers for this workshop. What? View. So as I said, both are from 1912. The first one is titled Contributions to a Discussion on Masturbation, and the second paper is a shorter technical paper called A Note on the Unconscious in Psychoanalysis, which I feel is actually a really impressive and clear summary of Freud's ideas about what the unconscious means. So let's start with Contributions to a Discussion on Masturbation, which is a bit longer and actually focuses on a summary of a psychoanalytic conference on masturbation. So Freud starts off, basically he's here writing the conclusion to a series of papers that were presented at the Psychoanalytic Society in 1912. He is, I think, functioning here as a type of master signifier or presenting a synthesis of the conference's ideas. He suggests that it's never the aim to remove diversities or arrive at conclusions. He suggests that the point of the society and the formation of the society is simply to focus on the problems of man's sexual life in the context of scientific examination, and that this had been sorely lacking in science. In fact, one of my main criticisms of science, even to this day, when we think about things like embodied cognition in particular, I think it's worth pointing out that there's in a real deep sense, a fact that science seems to delibidinalize knowledge. And it's Freud's here emphasis to say that science should be brought to a close examination of sexuality as opposed to a type of desexualization of the human organism. So the purpose of the collection was to specifically focus on the problems of masturbation that were forced by the emergence of psychoanalytic method as it relates to the neuroses. So to put it in simple terms, to what extent can masturbation either be a cause or an influence on the emergence of neuroses, or alternatively, to what extent are the act of masturbation a effect of a neurotic psychological disposition. Now, he starts off with three basic categories and this is here his function as a synthesizer of the Psychoanalytic Society, basically trying to tell us where the society agrees, where the society has disagreements, and where the society has open-ended uncertainties. So there are two main areas of agreement in the Psychoanalytic Society. That is the importance of fantasy for masturbation, and this should be juxtaposed against a biological or a somatic point of view. So the crucial thing here is that the act of masturbation in the human organism is a function of fantasy, and also that there is a sense of guilt associated with the act of masturbation. In fact, in a few podcasts, I have been pretty open about the fact that when I first started masturbating, it was coupled with this sort of feeling that I can't tell anyone about this. So you could say, for example, that when my spontaneous conscious reaction to masturbation, and it was mediated by fantasy, but my spontaneous reaction to masturbation was directly coupled with a sense of guilt. So to me, it makes sense that the Psychoanalytic Society has agreement on this, on these 2 points. Now, he adds that the society also agrees on a certain impossibility that is the impossibility of determining the positive or negative qualitative effects of masturbation. And I think that this, we see this indeterminacy vis-a-vis the positive or negative aspects of masturbation in contemporary discussions about masturbation. When we think about, for example, people in like the no-fap movement, these are people who are basically saying that masturbation is something that should be avoided, or rather sort of harnessing that sexual energy and not sort of using it unconsciously. Whereas there are other people who might view that as a type of fascist or a type of totalitarian view, a repressive view, let's say, on masturbation. And perhaps we're looking here for a middle ground between the two, but the society here is indeterminate vis-a-vis the positive negative dimensions. Now, they feel like there's unresolved issues about masturbation as it relates to the role of the somatic factor. Again, they're placing more emphasis on fantasy as opposed to biology. So this is interesting when you think, for example, about the range of masturbatory activity in humans, and as is pretty open today when it relates to the ubiquity of pornography and other types of materials like this. And they are also have unresolved differences on the injurious effects of masturbation, basically the negative side effects of it. We're going to get into that towards the end of the paper. There's also disagreements on the origin of the sense of guilt. So in other words, they may be in agreement that masturbation is coupled with a sense of guilt, but they don't know why the sense of guilt is so spontaneous to this activity. In other words, is it a result of a lack of satisfaction? Is it a result of social factors, social pressures? Or is it a result of the subject's own personality? When it comes to my own sort of self-reflective mechanism on this, I'm probably predisposed to the social factors explanation. But I think that would be interesting to discuss later in the discussion. And there's also unresolved differences as it relates to the ubiquity of masturbation in children. Is it universal? Is it not? And there's an interesting actual story that Freud tells in relationship to another man on the ubiquity of that, which we'll cover on the next slide after this one. So finally, there are significant uncertainties on masturbation within the society as it relates to, again, the mechanism. Now, as it relates to injurious effects, the mechanism of the injurious effects. We're going to, again, talk about that a lot later in a later slide. And as I sort of alluded to in the first slide, the etiological relation, that is the origin or the cause of the actual neuroses to masturbation. Basically, we're playing here with cause and effect. Is masturbation an effect of the neuroses, or is it a cause of the neuroses? What is the role masturbation plays? And I'll allude to that a little bit again in a later slide. So yeah, just to rehash that. So the society basically classifies three major developmental pathways. So here we can say that psychoanalysis from the beginning is predisposed to a developmental view of sexuality, and their main classificatory mechanisms for different masturbatory phases include infantile, children, and puberty. So this is actually quite revolutionary in the context of 1912, right? And it's related to a lot of the controversy that Freud stirs up within society at large as it relates to infantile sexuality. I think it is hard for us to imagine just how controversial this idea was back then, and just how much that these ideas have influenced and impacted the rest of the culture today, because it would be less alarming to people to suggest that actually, yes, infants do have masturbatory tendencies. Yes, children do play around with masturbation, that it's not just something that emerges in puberty, where we have that's basically the conventional notion. So he says the main limitation on the current psychoanalytic studies is that male masturbation has been given more attention than female masturbation. We should definitely be aware of that bias when it comes to this paper. And Freud is somewhat lamenting that fact in this paper. And then I tried to summarize a interesting sort of digression that Freud had as it related to the personal teleological biases with the ideology on masturbation. And in fact, he strongly critiques himself in this paper, which I thought was impressive. And that is in relation to the ubiquity of infantile masturbation. So Freud had the original position that masturbation was ubiquitous in infancy, and then he has subtracted that position in this paper. And he also sort of points out that the opposite tendency to saying that there is no masturbation in infancy, which was held by another individual, is also too personal and teleological. So the overall message I get from that aspect of this paper is that we should be aware of the way in which we are going to be predisposed to our own personal teleological point of view when it comes to sexuality, because it's so intimate and so close to our own experience. And we have to be aware of that if we're going to approach it, let's say, scientifically. Now, the most interesting part of this paper actually comes around this slide for me, which is the relationship to the actual neuroses and the way in which Freud describes his own view on the neuroses. He does a great job of using the metaphor that the way he views neuroses is like a psychological coding on somatic sexual manifestation. That just brings up to me a really interesting image, and it's a really interesting way of describing the relationship between the mind and the body, or the psyche and the body. It's kind of like what psychoanalysis is doing, is trying to approach a science of the way in which the psyche is inhabiting a body or reacting to a body. And he describes the entire neurotic pattern as a grain of sand at the center of a pearl. So you can think here of somatic sexual manifestation in different areas of the body. We're talking about the libidinal body, the oral surface, the anal surface, the genital surface, and the way in which a psychological coding gets placed on the experience of the psyche around these erogenous zones. And he says here, this is a really nice connection, I think, to the next paper, which is that hysteria is at bottom a small fragment of undischarged excitation connected with coitus, or a sexual fantasy. So you can see here why we might think masturbation is connected to the neuroses, and that the anxiety symptom is a nucleus of hysteria. So again, back to this metaphor of a grain of sand at the center of a pearl. We're talking here about the strange way in which the psyche gets fixated and either by a certain sexual presence, a certain sexual excitation, or a sexual absence in the case of hysteria, where there's an absence of undischarged excitation connected to coitus. So psychoanalysis here, now he towards the end of the paper starts to go into the evolving and maturing view Freud has about the consequence of psychoanalytic theory to civilization as a whole. He says that psychoanalysis attributes to every civilized human a certain amount of repression, of perverse impulses, anal eroticism, homosexuality, and that this repression is necessary in some sense for the formation of civilization. I think in some sense, by bringing this to consciousness, what Freud is trying to do is make us more mature as it relates to this process of repression. He also says that psychoanalysis attributes to every civilized individual a mother and father complex. This might be related to, for example, Jungian's idea of a father imago and a mother imago. These complexes are psychological images. That's the crucial dimension. And you can say here that psychoanalysis in some sense is trying to make scientific the relationship of our understanding to images, which are usually invisible to us and usually invisible to science, because we're again focusing on material focusing on substance, whereas psychoanalysis is focusing on an imagistic relationship to substance, or an imagistic relationship to matter. So he gives the analogy of the neuroses in relationship to the periodic table in chemistry, which actually brings up an interesting idea in my mind. He gives chemical analysis of organic substance is classified based on the difference of substance in relative amount of elements. So you have the periodic table, carbon atoms, oxygen atoms, hydrogen atoms, nitrogen atoms. Those classifications are based on the difference in substance in the relative amount of those elements. And he's saying that when we think about the difference between quote unquote normal people and neurotic people, we're talking about basically a difference in the intensity of conflict caused by complexes. So everyone has these imagistic complexes. It's just the intensity of the conflict which determines whether or not someone becomes neurotic, or someone or not is classified as healthy or normal. This is the final slide for this paper. He suggests that, again, we're focusing here when it relates to the origin of the neuroses in a conflict between two processes, the sexual urges and the ego trends. And he includes within the sexual urges masturbation. So again, there's this split consciousness, which we'll talk about more in the next presentation, and which has been a theme in these workshops. The split consciousness is basically that you have one conception of yourself in your ego, your civilized persona. You have another aspect of your consciousness, which is concerned with the sexual excitation and the sexual fantasies. And these two aspects of our consciousness are split, and they're difficult in some sense to bring together. And the conflict between the two can cause neuroses. Now, he does a really good job, and I think I've also experienced this myself, of describing the way in which if you either do an extreme of one or the other, in other words, you repress all your sexual urges in relationship to a civilized persona, or you let your sexual persona dominate you over and above your civilized persona, one or the other extreme, both lead to neuroses. So again, he's articulating a way in which we have to balance attention. We have to balance attention between our sexual urges and our civilized persona and have a sort of feedback between the two. Now, he says masturbation as pathogenic, he suggests, can be traced back to instincts manifesting themselves and resistances directed against those instincts. So it's all in some sense, and this is to me one of the most important points I've learned doing these workshops, is that it's not so much about the actual event, it's more about the ego's reaction to the actual event. In other words, a certain libidinal energy is going to come online, so to speak, but it is the ego's reaction to that energy that determines the neurotic pattern or not. Again, it's the image's relationship to the body. So I'll just conclude the paper with that point, which I think is really important to reflect on. And oh, sorry, there's more to this paper. Sorry. And actually, these points are really important. He says that masturbation can have three damaging results. One is an organic injury, meaning you are excessively masturbating, which can cause injury. But the two others, I think, are more important to think about, at least probably more common. The second one is that there is a psychological pattern that can manifest, which prevents the individual's attempt to alter the external world to satisfy a great need. We can think about this really deeply in relationship to pornography addiction that is emerging today. When people are fixating on their own infantile sexual imagination, instead of trying to basically make the unconscious conscious and manifest and mature in the world. I think that is one of the main damages and dangers of masturbation, is this withdrawal into oneself because you feel like you cannot meet your needs in the world. Then Connected to that, there's also the fixation of infantile sexual aims and the persistence of a psychological infantilism. So this is basically that basically what's on the line here is people's capacity to grow up, people's capacity to become adults, because your capacity to become an adult is in some sense dependent on whether or not you can mature the infantile sexuality. If you can mature the infantile sexuality, you're going to be able to sort of embrace yourself and bring your energy into the world. Whereas if you are unable to do this, you might remain in a permanent state of withdrawal. And then finally, he suggests that masturbation and the reduction of masturbation can reduce the potency of our libido, but civilization can see this as a positive thing. He also says that masturbation can reduce male aggressiveness, and civilization can also see this as a positive thing. So he's trying to here articulate the way in which there's this constant tension between libidinal satisfaction in individuals and civilizational goals. That civilizational goals and individual satisfaction are often never linked with each other, and they're often in a conflict with each other. And the capacity of the individual to, in some sense, sacrifice their own libidinal enjoyment for the civilizational goals is oftentimes what's at stake here in the formation of a neurosis. You know, can you become civilized and still be an entity that enjoys one's own body energy, let's say? This is crucially at stake. He also says that the cultivation of civilized virtues is here related to masturbation, and that sexual moderation is necessary in some sense for trustworthiness. To connect it to that, the last point being that virtue accompanied by full potency is usually felt as a hard task. Now, I think this is actually a Nietzschean point, because in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche makes the point that one transforms one's libidinal desire into pure virtue, and that where there was once only pathological desire, there is now virtue. So there's a way in which the libidinal erotic enjoyment and the cultivation of a virtuous character are here linked in a type of interesting sublimation trajectory. I think that's very, very interesting to think about. But the most important aspect of that to me is whether or not it can be achieved authentically. Because if you try to be virtuous by repressing your sexuality, and this is, for example, what happens with Catholic priests all the time, is that they'll try to be extremely virtuous, but they are doing it inauthentically. In some sense, not developing a relationship to the libidinal body, and this can come out in a pathological excess. So this is a very difficult process to master, let's say, or at least get some control over. Again, this is related to Freud's assertion that sexual education is extremely difficult. Okay, so the next paper, a note on the unconscious and psychoanalysis. I want to say this is a very important paper, much shorter. The other one was quite in depth and long, so I apologize about that if it took too long. Just make sure everyone's mute so at least for this presentation. So the note on the psychoanalysis and unconscious. This is a very useful paper. This paper is very useful because he does, in my view, the best job yet of describing what he means by the unconscious at this stage in his career as it relates to the psychological unconscious. So, and he states from the outset that his goal in this paper is to describe the unconscious as plain as possible. So he makes the distinction between consciousness as a present or manifest conception to our psyche and of which we are aware. The unconscious he labels as an absent or latent conception in the psyche and which we are unaware. He gives the example of memory, that there are many memories we have, images from the past, which we may actually be unaware of most of the time, but which can emerge in our psyche as it related to stimulated from a certain situation, or which can have, as we're going to go into detail with, or which can have an active role on our behavior without our awareness. So he makes a really interesting point, and this is a very useful distinction in my view, which is that philosophy had made the mistake of equating the term consciousness with psychological or psyche. And this, he says, ignores the unconscious psyche. So the distinction here, which is more primary, is the psyche, which he divides between conscious and unconscious. Whereas when we use the term conscious, we should be aware that we're talking about a portion of the psyche as a whole, not the whole psyche. So the unconscious psyche, and I would relate, or I would rather recommend the movie Secret Passion, which was actually shared in the Facebook group for this workshop by Richard Koenigsberg, where this whole hypnotic mechanism is really dramatized really well. It makes it really clear. But the unconscious psyche, he says, was discovered in a well-known experiment related to post-hypnotic suggestion. So hypnotized individuals are given orders. When the hypnotized individual wakes up, they do not recall the actual order, but they feel the impulse to fulfill the order without knowing why. So this, he says, is a great description of how the unconscious psyche works in actuality, whereas the hypnotic suggestion is a good sort of laboratory experiment demonstrating the existence of an unconscious psyche. And we're going to talk a lot more about this, but the basic idea here is that when you are sort of acting out impulses, you may not know why you're acting out those impulses. But here, what Freud's saying is that there's an unconscious image which is forcing itself upon you from the perspective of the psyche as a whole. And then that's, again, to illustrate the importance of the distinction between conscious psyche, unconscious psyche. So there he goes into the dynamic unconscious, the idea that an idea can become active and remain unconscious at the same time. So in other words, say I'm sort of like resting late at night and I have a sort of urge to masturbate, but I don't know why. It's not necessarily because of a somatic reason. It's because of a phantasmatic reason. There's an image that's trying to impress itself upon me, that's trying to enact itself in me. And that image is coming from a very intimate, very deep part of me, but I'm not aware of it. Again, so these impulses become active even if they remain unconscious. So the hysterical phenomena, he says, is similar to post-hypnotic suggestion, and that the hysteric is actually full of active but unconscious ideas. He says that the hysteric is ruled by unconscious ideas. In some sense, their master, their authority, is the unconscious idea. There's a dominance of the unconscious. So the active unconscious ideas revealed by analysis, he says, are an essential fact in all forms of neurosis. So in other words, this process of becoming more aware about the totality of our psyche is crucial in the, let's say, battle against neuroses and the formation of a mature adult character. Again, building on the model I've been trying to play with throughout this workshop, you have the split consciousness being that of the conscious psyche and the unconscious psyche. And Freud here introduces the other important distinction in sort of his career, which is also present in the interpretation of dreams, which is the distinction between the fore or pre-conscious ideas, which can easily pass into consciousness, and the unconscious proper, which is restricted from consciousness by resistance. So again, you'll probably have ideas, and this is probably most practically relevant to our dream state or even our sexual fantasies, where there are some ideas which are really on the borderline between the unconscious and the conscious, meaning that we're not fully conscious of them, but they are appearing in our consciousness without much resistance. And there's the unconscious proper, which is guarded intensely and guarded with defenses. So those are the main distinctions he wants to make as it relates to the unconscious. And the consciousness split is that certain ideas or psychological acts constitute a conscious aspect, and others become detached and estranged from consciousness. And we're going to get into why that is. Of course, it's related to unpleasure. It's related to ideas that are disturbing to our conscious identity. So he makes the point that philosophers must accept the existence of unconscious ideas. This is basically Freud's intervention in philosophy. Again, he is criticizing philosophers for equating consciousness with the psyche as a whole. And he is saying that the fact of a shifting consciousness, of an oscillation between two different psychological complexes, which become conscious or unconscious in alteration, is a fact of the psychological existence. I think that this is basically intuitive. When we think about the totality of the subject from the perspective of waking consciousness versus our sleeping consciousness, there's just a fact that there's two different psychological complexes at work. I often think about this in terms of a Mobius strip or a Mobius band. This is something that Lacan made very famous, where you have, it's almost like the psyche as a whole is two sides of a strip, which get twisted in a certain way. Now, healthy individuals, he says, also have neurotic patterns. They also have an unconscious psyche. This is connected to the last paper and Freud's emerging distinction between healthy and neurotic people, where lapses in language, errors of memory and speech, forgetting of names, depend on the action of strong unconscious ideas. This is very interesting when you're talking to people in day-to-day life, when someone has a tendency to forget their car keys, or when someone has a tendency to sort of always forget this person's name. Freud's saying that these are dependent on strong defenses in the unconscious. So unconscious activity can pierce into consciousness, but exertion is needed. That meaning that you have to overcome a feeling of repulsion. You have to overcome a feeling of resistance. So if there are ideas within you, which on first contact you feel disgusted by, first contact you feel repulsed by, these are the mechanisms of conscious defense, preventing you from getting in touch with perhaps intimate ideas from your past, which have become repressed over time. The unconscious idea is excluded from consciousness by living forces which oppose themselves to reception while not rejecting others. That is, again, the pre-conscious or the foreconscious. So there's basically levels of disgust or levels of unpleasure, which consciousness is sort of acting as a censor to. You know, I even get the image here of sort of like a cell membrane. You know how a cell membrane will select what pathogens can come in and what pathogens can go out? It's almost like consciousness is acting like a boundary or barrier, preventing certain ideas from coming in and allowing others to come in. So repulsion from unconscious ideas is provoked by tendencies of the embodied contents. So in other words, this is related to our first presentation on masturbation, where we're saying here that the strong unconscious ideas are related to the disturbance that they cause in relationship to embodiment. It's the psyche's relationship to embodiment, which is the problem. That's what's disturbing for the psyche, is confronting certain dimensions which are perceived as a threat in some sense to embodiment. So let's see how many slides. I think we have 2 slides left. So he says, interpretation of dreams is the most complete work done in analysis. He says that is the most impressive scientific work that has been done. Certainly, it's a landmark in psychoanalysis. By 1912, perhaps it is the most important. There are, I think, other landmark papers and books by Freud that emerge after 1912, but this is a really fundamental one. Talking about dream formation, that thoughts aroused in the day succeed in finding connections with unconscious thoughts repressed since childhood, and that these unconscious thoughts repressed since childhood gain the power to manifest themselves at night in a dream formation distortion. That's the difference between the latent and the manifest content. So the repressed unconscious thoughts can become active again in this mechanism of distortion. And I would recommend for anyone who either hasn't watched the videos that we've done on dreams to go back and watch those videos on dreams, where there's a much fuller explanation of the relationship between the manifest and the latent content. So this is the final slide, and then we'll open up discussion. So there's basically the idea here that with dream thoughts undergo a change, a disguise, or a distortion by the unconscious helpmate, that the unconscious thoughts occupied consciousness when they ought not to, and part of the unconscious emerged to consciousness when it would have otherwise been resisted. So in other words, while we're sleeping, while we're dreaming, the resistances of our ego are lowered, and the unconscious thoughts can more easily emerge. And that's why the analysis and the study of dreams is the so-called royal road to the unconscious. Because the censor, because the guard against the consciousness, because the guard or the membrane that is acting against the unconscious ideas has been lowered or has been annihilated almost completely. So I thought that was a really good paper, really important and clear. And I will stop sharing, and we can chop it up. Thank you for your attention, by the way. And excited to dive into this. Let me just. I think that for me, go ahead, Eric.
Okay, I'll get the ball rolling. I would say one of the things that impressed me with both of these papers, and I'll try to link the papers together a little bit, is Freud seems to be focusing here on what Lacan would call the real. And I think it's something that we neglect because of the nature of the real as being precisely that which we can't really talk about. But nevertheless, Freud tries to bring attention to the real, and especially in his work on metapsychology, which he begins with, the project for scientific psychology, where he's really, at a more of a biological level, describing the neurons, the neural pathways where he describes this diversion of psychical energy into the unconscious, the function of the sensor, and he's retracing some of that ground here in the second paper we looked at. But I think what he's really getting at here is the real of the libidinal drive and the real of the function of the unconscious, what he calls the sensor, that function that, like you talked about, the cell membrane that determines what can pass and what cannot. And I think that is precisely what we find in both of these papers is Freud is dealing with this presence of the real, and how do we as a subject deal with this presence of the real. And I think what, for me, and this is because I'm kind of focusing on this area right now in my own reading, is coming to the late period of Lacan, where he theorizes the relationship of the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary with the Borromean knot. And it's this idea, there's these three rings of the Borromean knot, and they are linked up in such a way that if any one of them is cut, all of them fall apart. In other words, it's just one that is linking them all together. And we can think here of the real as being precisely that which is holding this, our symbolic and our imaginary, the ego, together in a certain way. And that particular configuration we could just say is the neuroses. It's the neurotic subject that is being held together in a particular way by the real. And people can have maybe a strong symbolic order, whether it be a religious dogma about the libido against masturbation and so on, social pressure and so on, or we may have a particularly strong fantasy life in the imaginary. These different ways that we hold everything together. And what is, I guess, common in all of that is this real of the libido that we seem to have no idea what to do with. There's no particular solution to the real of the libido, and I think that's really what is at the core of both of these papers, and it seems to be what Freud and his colleagues seem to be quite befuddled with, is dealing with that particular real. And I think that's especially true. And I was so impressed by Freud's honesty, he's always this way, but his honesty in acknowledging where he just simply does not, where he's running up against that real. He doesn't know what to do with certain phenomena. So that may be a good way to kind of start our discussion is just thinking about this in terms of the real, and how our symbolic and imaginary orders become tied up, knotted up by it.
Yeah.
In such a configuration that we have these neuroses.
Yeah, I'd say that in relationship to a lot of the work that I've been doing in the last year, there's similar to the symbolic imaginary real, there's the triadic distinction of pathos, logos, and mythos. And it's kind of like, when I think about pathos, it's kind of like when in relationship to logos, there's a way in which, like, to give the example of the Catholic priest, for example, it's kind of like the logos becomes a defense mechanism against pathos. And there's a leakage of images that are basically unconscious forces, where the Catholic priest will start doing things which are contradictory in relationship to their symbolic order. So when we think about the Borromean knot as a model for this symbolic imaginary real, or say pathos, logos, and mythos, I think that it's really important, or maybe an important praxis for an individual subject, to keep all of these dimensions in constant communication and conversation, where your logos is an order which can basically openly interact with pathos and mythos, and sort of have a loop that's interacting between the two, so that you don't fall into absurd contradictions, which can destroy your entire existence, basically, which is like the collapse of your entire structure. But yeah, good articulation there.
I have a sort of a question here. Eric, how would you look at this relationship between the real and the unconscious? Would you make that claim that the real is the unconscious, or you would want to have a more nuanced relationship between the two?
Well,
yeah, I think.
Go ahead, Eric.
I think that was Lacan's conclusion towards the end of his life, was that there is this unconscious real, And you can see some of that discussion in some of the work done by Jacques-Alain Miller and others, kind of picking up where Lacan leaves off. And I think that's kind of some of the stuff that we don't really get into as theorists. We tend to stop, and it's but the clinicians are doing that work, and there has been a reconfiguration of the Lacanian clinic, at least in some areas, kind of around this notion of the unconscious real. And so, yeah, there is a symbolic component, obviously, to the unconscious. Lacan bases his whole career around this idea of the unconscious is structured like a language. But there is a real component of it, and I think that starts from the very beginning with Freud's discovery. And I think I think we have to, there is a biological essence to it that how, no matter how it appears in the symptom, or how we think about how the unconscious is what is in the unconscious is displaced linguistically, metaphorically, and metonymically, and thus symbolic. There is still that real component of it.
All right, Sandra, did you wanna unmute yourself?
Yeah. So a question is: does this mean when you say that there is an unconscious real? Is there another type of real, like a conscious one, maybe? And I was also wondering, what is the relationship of this, there is any, with the lamella? Where does this fit in here? I was reading about this yesterday. And I also have a little bit of trouble understanding the preconscious.
Okay.
And well, it also came to my mind that the unconscious, when Cadell mentioned the Moebius strip, right? So we have to think that that our unconscious is not only within us, but it is also outside, and how we interact and how we continue speaking, which is essential, right? For I don't know, it fuels desire, and yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
All right, there's a few questions, and Eric, if you want to answer some of these yourself, or anyone else, I'll let you do that. I want to say that from I think one of probably the most interesting, let's say, concept in Lacan is lamella, and the most obscure, and really important to study the few sections in Lacan where he mentions lamella. My understanding of lamella is that it's the relationship between the imaginary real. It's basically probably the way he describes it is kind of like the level of the image which wants to close into a perfect sphere. And it's almost like the most intense. This is where his sort of weird psychoanalytic references to Plato emerge about the sphericity of man and the androgynous creature. And maybe we can even say like the core imaginary real of the bisexual fantasies that Freud sort of says is core to the unconscious. So that's where my mind points when it comes to the lamella. I just want to also say that as it relates to the preconscious or foreconscious, we're talking, let me give a really practical, concrete example. You wake up in the morning and you have fragments of images from your dreams last night. That is the sort of preconscious, foreconscious, because they're images which can access your consciousness without resistance. You have consciousness of them. Whereas if you were to explore your dream in an analysis, you would encounter likely resistances to certain images, which probably are being guarded by defenses. So that's, Eric, did you have anything you might want to also add to that? Because I think her questions were related to what you said.
Yeah, specifically when I said the unconscious real, I think there's an ambiguity in English with our genitive construction there. I could have said the real of the unconscious. That is, when we talk about the unconscious, we tend to talk about it in its symbolic effects, but there is something there in the real. Now, the real, as Lacan uses this term, is precisely that which cannot be signified. So it is, in some sense, by definition, unconscious, because it's something we can never, even though we might be able to see it or feel it, we cannot talk about it in symbolic language. And I think maybe I could just give an example of what I was talking about from my own pathologies. Is I have and you may notice it, I have something of a bit of a stutter, not a stammer, not like a Porky Pig stammer, but there will occur a particular word that I can form in my mind. I can have it in my mind. I can write it on paper, but I can't spit it out. There's a resistance there, and it's in the real. It's in the biology of my vocal mechanisms. I cannot spit out, and it seems as though it happens with words that begin with particular consonants, like R or a Y, and I'm kind of just beginning to my own auto analysis and trying to figure out exactly what this is. But there was something probably that was repressed at some point in my early development that manifests itself now in this resistance that has a very real, symptomatic element to it. And there is within this kind of a blockage of this libidinal energy that wants to manifest itself in certain symbolic or imaginary ways, but there is something in the real of the unconscious that is manifesting itself out in the symptom there. So that's kind of perhaps a good illustration of where the unconscious has this symbolic aspect to it, but also this real aspect to it. And a lot of the current research and theory that's going on in the Lacanian clinic is really trying to focus upon that kind of thing.
Thanks, Eric. Just before moving to David, I would like to also add sort of an interesting thing I read recently about, similar to how Eric's describing his own auto-analysis of this blockage. There's an emergence in North American schools of teenage girls that are developing violent tics. Like they'll want to stab things, or their body will shake. And I think that this is an example of the type of the real of the unconscious, which is just striving to manifest itself in a climate which is sort of antagonistic to discussing sort of the relationship between sexuality and gender, for example. But there's a way in which the unconscious tries to make itself manifest, and you'll find actual bodily tics, you'll find bodily manifestations of sort of unconscious energy, which is looking for an outlet. Again, the metaphor that Freud often used in a previous paper, like the dam, like there's a river that's being dammed up and the water is trying to get through, but the real here is this sort of tension, like this, and it has a physical, real biological manifestation like Eric's talking about. David, would you like to go next?
Okay, yeah. I really like this metaphor of the cellular membrane, about the inside and the outside and the membrane in between the two. But I keep like trying to struggling against this deep separation between the real and the symbolic. For me, there is a dimension where the two coincide somehow. And maybe that's enlightenment. I don't know. I'm working on it. But picking this metaphor, picking up this metaphor of the membrane, it could provide a good metaphor for what I'm trying to say. Because maybe this dimension where the symbolic and the real are kind of coincide together, it could be the membrane, being inside the membrane, instead of being inside, which is consciousness, or outside, which is the real, in which I don't think it's the real, it's a fantasy. When you are inside, you think the real is outside, but that's a fantasy, actually. This real completely precluded, completely alienated by language. I think it's a fantasy. I don't think it's existing. I think instead, for this, there is like a very nice, and I think Zizek is pointing in this direction when, for example, he talks about the beauty of a woman, no? Because he talks about this in several parts in his books. He talks about love as a disease, and as like, if you want to forget a woman, usually people say to you, oh, think about his biological side. Think about when he's gonna get old. Think about when she's gonna lose the hair, and when she's gonna get and this is like, supposedly, it's what naively we think is the real, no? When Eric is talking about the biological part of the real, no. Zizek says that's not the real. The real is the beauty of the girl, is the beauty of the person that has so much influence on us. So the real is not substantial. That's what he's saying. It's like virtual. So it's the membrane. Yeah, there were other things I wanted to say. Sorry, I've been.
Well, when I was saying that, what I was really kind of referring to, and I say the biological, was that which we might say is biological, but it functions at the level of the virtual, and that is that the sensor, which is that membrane. And I think where I made the same conclusion that I think you did is when Freud, and he wrote this paper in English, or no, I'm sorry, this is the one on masturbation, but he uses the French term les défauts de ses vertus, and then les vertus de ses défauts, the defects of the virtue and the virtue of the defects. And I think we can see this as how the symbolic and the real are knotted up, where within the virtue, that is the symbolic, there is a defect. And in the defect, that is in the real, there is a virtue, there is this beauty, you might say, that emerges out of it. And so I think you're right. There is this this knotting up of the symbolic and the real, where the real and the symbolic kind of flow in and out of each other. Yeah. That was the idea that I was kind of getting.
I don't think that we should separate the two. Like, I don't agree with the fact when people say that the real is the thing that we can't speak about, you know. Well, there is something there that we should go against Lacan, and we should go against Freud. In that point, we should go, and that's, I think, is Zizek is doing, is like trying to be more philosophical than Lacan and Freud, and saving philosophy basically, because otherwise we fall into mysticism.
Well, the model that Lacan's using and that Eric was referencing was the model of the Borromean knot, where the imaginary, symbolic, and real are all connected. You can never take one as an isolated entity. Of course, sometimes when we speak, it might appear that we're doing that because of a limitation of our own language, but it's hard to talk about this hyper object of the imaginary, symbolic, and real all entangled with each other. But as it relates to your, I think, correct observation about the body as it relates to the beautiful body, let me, the beautiful body versus the old body, think about the woman when she's losing her hair and stuff like this. Let me just give a direct quote from Slavoj Žižek's Less Than Nothing, chapter 1, as it relates to this point. The real, and this is to use the language of the real announces itself in the seductive appearance of the naked body, in the spectral appearance of the naked body. That is to say, in the opposition between the spectral appearance of the sexualized body and the repulsive body in decay, it is the spectral appearance which is the real, while the decaying body is merely reality, that to which we take recourse in order to avoid the deadly fascination of the real as it threatens to draw us into the vortex of jouissance, end quote. So there's this idea that what that quote's trying to get at, again with the Borromean knot, is I think the relationship between the imaginary and the real. But like, it's hard to talk about all these things in this very complicated way. But I think that your project of trying to rehabilitate or to make clear the symbolic dimension as its relationship to the real is something to continue pursuing. Did you want to say anything else, or otherwise I'll move to Javier?
Carol, one way to think about this problem would be, this issue of incompleteness theorem of Gödel in that sense. Problem is not that. Yeah, the problem is not that you can't speak of the real. You always speak of the real. That's never an issue. The issue is, even whenever you speak it, there is always something unspeakable left within that domain. You extend that domain, you can speak whatever is left outside. Again, there will be something else which you can't speak. So at all points of time, something is left outside, and you can always go and get that outside inside. That's never a problem. But when you go and get that outside inside, there's something else which will be coming outside. So there's a constant slippage against which human beings are always finding their grasp of reality, and that slippage we need to think and understand. It's not a simple issue of it whether we can grasp the real or not. We can always grasp the real. That's never a problem.
I think that's a great point. In relationship to a previous conversation David and I had, I wanted to reference Žižek's central thesis in Hegel in A Wired Brain, where he talks about symbolic inconsistency as the relationship to the real. Like we can never get a complete symbolic representation of the real. There, like you're saying, there's always this slippage. There's always this inability to fully understand the real and so forth. Javier?
Okay. So I'm relatively new, so all the Lacan terms and everything would be a little lost, but I'm still going to participate in this. No worries. I think what really fascinated me, and if you guys can connect this with Lacan and stuff, that'd be really fascinating for me. I was really interested in the origin of guilt and the connection between these two papers. And I thought turning to narrative was an interesting point, and trying to explain this guilt. And I was thinking about Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve is sort of the original naked people, and the fall, right? But symbolically, I don't know what this fall is, but when you enact in this masturbation, right? It's this, you are left with this nakedness, this pure nakedness, and realization of this nakedness, and then you look at the guilt, and you can, and in a biblical sense, you can refer to this as the, your fall, in a sense. But what is this fall? And I was really paying attention to how the masturbatory act emerges, and I know Freud says something along the lines that it's due to limited, limited conditions. But I felt like reversing this. Actually, masturbation is probably close to the most unconditional, meaning that it requires very few conditions to meet, right? In terms of actually, like, let's say eating food, like I don't have to, like, if I don't have money, I won't be able to feed myself. But to be able to masturbate, everything is already basically there, all the conditions, essentially. other than the fantasies, but the fantasies can be created in the mind or relatively met easily. And so I thought this was interesting because it's an act that's relatively close to something that is what we would define as unconditional, right? It's relatively close to that. It's not quite unconditional, but it's one of the acts that we can do that is close to unconditional. And I found this really intriguing because it's, when we talk about love, right, we always fantasize about a love that's unconditional. And in some sense, masturbation is very close to a self-love in that sense. But I was, again, going back to the guilt, I was really thinking about why does one feel this? And it's my theory that we are creative individuals, that there seems to be a disposition that we are creative in nature, right? This urge to be with the other and at the same time create. And so when we fantasize about the other, right, in this fantasy, the paradox is that we actually enact the other, right? The male will sort of replicate some kind of otherness to reach a releasement, and so in some sense he's wanting to unite with something. But if we compare it to the sex itself, it's this nature to reproduce, to create. But masturbation is very unique because in some sense you become the self-sustained creator, the self-sustained, you're sort of enacting this self-sustained fantasy of being a sole creator without needing the other. And I think my suspicion is that the origin of guilt is actually in some sense this, right, where you enact masturbation because you feel the need to have to be with another, to satisfy, because the other is not there. But I think the guilt kind of becomes distorted because actually it might be a contentment of being, coming to terms with, I guess, a self-sustained creator, which is very weird to look at. And I found this very strange because, I mean, just to entertain the idea, I found very strange because it's like when, it's like when I'm wanting love, right? I want somebody, but then I thought what would be most repressed would be able to accept that I want to be alone. I felt that to be probably the most bizarre and probably a very hard thing to come to terms with, and something that I think would be repressed, which kind of made sense to me because at the end of the day, I mean, it sounds ridiculous that somebody wants to be alone and someone's content with that, right? Especially when we look at societal factors and everything like that, where we're sort of driven to this idea that we're social human beings, we need social things and so on. But this, this is what I came to some degree. I was entertaining this idea that maybe there's this reversal where it's actually a kind of contentment in some sense. But at the same time, I think this creative energy is the reason why I think the masturbatory act can become in access, is because the creative energy needs to be directed in some sense. And if you're not doing anything with that creative energy, you will withdraw because you want to enact the idea of being a creator solely for yourself. But if you put things out into existence, like your own work, your own creative process, painting, whatever, I think you can actually have a relation with this thing in a healthy way. But that's the kind of things I was thinking about.
I think what you're describing, and please, I'll let anyone else respond to this very interesting reflection just in a moment. But I think what you're describing as it relates to the withdrawal and the creating something like painting and developing a healthy relationship to the masturbatory energy is in fact how Freud describes the dialectical emergence of the artist. The dialectical emergence of the artist is someone who goes into the alone with the alone. The dialectical emergence of the artist is someone who develops a relationship to their most, let's say, socially pathological fantasies, and is able to create out of that energy something which is socially revered, something which is socially worshipped, something which is actually the cause of their sort of unique singularity as a creative entity. So I think that point of your reflection is really, and there's so many other points of your reflection that I thought were useful. Did anyone else want to respond to that?
Yeah, I did, because my original doctoral work was in the ancient Near East. So I wanted to respond to his analogy of Adam and Eve. And Javier, well, once again, excellent thoughts there. I thought they were very insightful. What is very interesting about your bringing in the Adam and Eve narrative is that, contrary to the way that it's been interpreted throughout most of at least Christian history, early Jewish and Christian history, is that it's actually an ascent narrative, not a fall. And it's an ascent in the sense that it is a myth along the Promethean type, where mankind is in a sort of primal state, and the gods are withholding some secret knowledge. And there is a lesser divine being that surreptitiously gives that knowledge to mankind, and they become like the gods. And that's what we find at the very end of that narrative. Elohim, God says, behold, man has become like one of us, knowing both good and evil. And so there is what we could, in Lacanian terms, call an ascent into the symbolic. So in other words, the Adam and Eve narrative really is an Oedipal myth. I think we could see it that way. We see the same process in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Enkidu is this wild, primal man, and he's causing a lot of trouble. And the king sends out a temple prostitute to sleep with him, and he kind of tames his sexual energy, and he ascends into civilization. That is, he ascends into the symbolic. And so, if we think about that Adam and Eve narrative in terms of an ascent into the symbolic, and seeing that then as an Oedipal type of myth, or an Oedipal process, where there is this castration that brings one into the symbolic. I think we could think of masturbation and I think you did this, correct me if I'm wrong, but we could see it as a failure or a reversion from the symbolic. That is a reversion back into the real of the sexual libido. And Freud talks about it in terms of that infantile libido. The masturbation is a reversion to the infantile type, and I think that is exactly what we find in the Adam and Eve narrative, in this kind of a failure or a reversion to something that is an aversion to the symbolic, even perhaps.
I think that just to maybe, did someone else want to say something there?
Yeah, I want to respond to Xavier. It's a very interesting thing. I was just wondering about, I was just thinking of Alenka Zupančič, and when she's talking of anti-sexes and the sexless other. So today we are also, this kind of, the fact that we need to engage with the other. And this is an interesting relation that you are drawing between guilt and masturbation, where one is not engaging with the other. And I was also thinking, and I was wondering that one can also see that how how increasingly we are becoming this guilty society, that it's a society which is highly riding on pleasure, but it's also society that is also guilty constantly about the same pleasures, which we can see even in this anti-sexes and the sexless other that Alenka was talking about, and we can see around also. I'm in India. Even in India, I can see that where love has become much more bothersome than masturbation. So, the fact that I don't know if in Freud's time, dildo or the sex doll, it was so much in, but today this expectation or even this need of engaging with the other, even that is not felt. I mean, who has time to fall in love? And the fall that Zizek also talk of, the real fall that happens in love. Who has time for that when there is a dildo and when there is a sex doll, when one can attain things which can be done? And when sex also, when sex with the other also becomes a sexless other, which is a masturbatory act only. When masturbation happens, even during sex and even during love. So, yeah, I was just thinking of that,
I remember Zizek talking about this problem, that in the pandemic time, the issue is not so much so that people have too much sex and stuff like that. You're heading into a time when people would say, who would have sex? I would just want to go home, watch porn, masturbate, and get done with it. Why would I even invest that kind of energy in? So this is the issue of other free enjoyment that we have to think about in that sense. And masturbation can actually do both. In one way, it can protect you from the other. In that sense, it can give you a certain space for enjoyment in which you do not have you don't have to engage with the other in that sense. On the other hand, it can also, in some sense, give you a longer route to get attached back to the other. In that sense, it can shield you for a while from the violence of the other, so that you can find a relationship back, and which is why it becomes extremely interesting and extremely difficult thing to understand. And even when I was reading the essay, I was seeing this Freud is also struggling with that problem, whether it is actually injurious or harmful all the time, or whether it has some benefits. It has, and then that struggle remains within it, because it shares a very complicated relationship with the other in that sense. It can give you a longer route back to connect with the other also, and it can completely short circuit.
How are you charting the latter over here? I mean, the longer route to other. In masturbation, I mean, do you think there is a possibility of engaging with the other in masturbation? If fantasy, yes.
Yeah, of course. For example, even very simple example, forget all of those big theory stuff. Very simple example, if you think about it, your lover is very far from you. You would engage in some kind of fantasy and masturbatory act so that you can meet her or him later, isn't it? Those are very, very, very basic things. We all as human beings do it. We all find certain, and as Javier and even Keitel was pointing out to us, art is one space where you actually submit yourself into this sphere of imagination, so that you can bring something back for the other in that sense, the society, and something which is of value and important for the society, and so on and so forth. It's something we need to think much more about. We don't understand it very much, I feel.
I like this. Sorry, this idea of connected both to what you're saying, Chitan, and Javier, which you also alluded to, of this space of masturbation as this space of withdrawal and desire for aloneness, which some people may have a great resistance to, but actually could be a weird dialectical passage back to the other, and back to, whether that's coming back to a creative energy, whether that's coming back to the desire to engage with a real human person. Because in some sense, with a withdrawal into the alone with the alone, we're able to get to know the images and the feelings within our self, which may have sort of been unnecessarily repressed, may have been unnecessarily sort of condemned, or we may have had self sort of restriction or self sort of humiliation, guilt about confronting these images. And it actually might help us become more authentic, might help us to become more socially appreciated by the other, because we're bringing more of ourselves to the table, which might actually be emotionally disturbing on some level, but more real. Less, just this, you often have the stereotype of people in marriages who have to basically hide so much of themselves in order to keep the order alive. And this allowance of allowing the other to go into their alone space, giving the person their alone space as actually a powerful way to build stronger relationships. And I think that you've actually pointed to that a lot, Javier, in some of your YouTube videos about the aloneness as an important precondition to real love. Yeah, so very, very interesting.
I think it's interesting that the German word for masturbation is onani, which is a reference to onanism, is an older term that in English, and that is a reference to the Hebrew Bible, a character named Onan. And what it's actually referring to is what we would call today coitus interruptus. And what Onan does is he's being required to perform levirate marriage, where he's required to take a sister-in-law whose husband has died and sire children with her, but he refuses. He pulls out and spills his seed on the ground, and this is he's condemned for that. And so within this notion of onanism is this refusal of the other, and I really like that idea that in the masturbation or the coitus interruptus, there is this refusal of the other, and that's just so beautifully captured in that.
But you see, I wonder if it can be. Can I speak?
Rashanik, welcome.
Hi. It's like what you said, Cadell. It can be like, and what Freud said. Whether Freud said that or you said that, like it can be healthy. Masturbation can be healthy, and it can be very kind of unhealthy, like in terms of taking you away from yourself. So it's got both. Like the relationship with the other is fraught, especially if you're neurotic. And usually the other person would be neurotic. So in a way, it doesn't end in a sexual experience. You still have to relate to the other person. You have to live with your doubts, your worries. Do they love you? Do they not love you? Have they left you? Have they not? All of that. You don't have any of that in masturbation. So I think in a way, it frees you from some of your neurotic kind of excesses that can play themselves out in relationships. But I also think there is something about a healthy experience of one's own sexuality. So you get, I think it can be both. Like it can be actually, you can actually do what you do in relationships with yourself through masturbation, or you can just kind of, get in touch with your own kind of rhythm and sense of self and body, and be able to kind of experience something. So I think it's sort of, it can be alone with the alone, as you say it, or it can be away from yourself, getting away from yourself through compulsive sort of, because maybe the other is there with you when it's compulsive. It's like there's an absence of another and there's a longing for another. But yeah, that's all.
I like what you're saying about emphasizing the way in which in sexuality you always have to deal with the other, the actual other, which can be sort of really problematic from the standpoint of provoking a certain neurotic pattern or dealing with certain problems. I would frame this as, in order to have a sexual relationship with the other, one has to find a way to manage or negotiate the non-relationship. One has to find a way to manage or negotiate the impossibility of the one. It's like there's the impossibility of the one and there's the necessity of the one as a paradox. And that in order to actually embody that, in order to actually sort of sustain that over time, you need to have a really good relationship with yourself and the other person has to have the same thing.
That's right.
So even if you're put together, if the other person's feeling like the non-relationship is too much of a burden, then they're going to have the neurotic reaction, which can also have a transference relationship on you. So in that sense, I would say, like, you know, again, this should be part of sexual education, which is kind of like a conscious relationship to masturbation and fantasy and your own self-relationship and how you sort of want to manifest that. We don't have conversations about that, but I think it would be really useful. And in that sense, like, what I've become really attracted to, not just sort of like the yogi philosophy, which I know we've talked a lot in previous workshops, but also sort of thinking about like tantric sexuality. So like when Freud is saying masturbation can be unhealthy or masturbation can be healthy, I think the question, or like whether masturbation is injurious, it's like, to what extent are we developing a conscious relationship to our own sexual energy? And I think that is in some sense what's being strived for in tantric practices, which is kind of like an acceptance. You know, it's like, instead of in Buddhism where I see there's like this negation of desire because it's impossible, I see in Tantra it's almost like an affirmation of desire because we can't get rid of it anyway. It's like, yes, it's impossible, but we can't get rid of it. So let's work with the impossible, you know, like.
There's a Rilke's line, you love somebody when you stand for his or her solitude, in that sense. You stand protection for his or her solitude, something of that nature. That love is an act of standing protection for somebody else's solitude. You know, it is protecting somebody else's solitude. It's not about actually removing all aloneness and solitude from that person.
Yes. I love this. I love this idea that the position, and I know, again, to sort of plug, Javier's got a video about this, but I love this idea that most of what we call love is actually a obfuscation of our fear of being alone. Like that we're using love to prevent contact with our aloneness, and that real love can emerge when we're comfortable with our own aloneness. And then you can actually love from a different standpoint, as you're saying, Chitan, to stand for his or her solitude in some sense and to respect that.
And this has been one of the biggest questions that I've been trying to answer when I would read someone like Rilke, where he says to learn to carry that solitude with you wherever you go. Because our current understanding of solitude is, you know, me in my room, I'm learning to be alone, but to actually carry that solitude within you wherever you go, even in a social setting, that's a whole different ball game, because you're constantly confronted with desire for the other and some kind of neurotic temptation at some point. And that's why I become so fascinated about how does one, I mean, for two people, this is exactly what it stands for in this one sentence: alone with the alone. This is the relationship of, I would say, the ultimate love, right? Between two individuals, is to carry a solitude, both of you. And in a sense, you become alone with an alone. And one of my favorite lines from Gibran, it's not that we should share from the same cup, but that we both fill each other's cup without both consuming from one cup, right? And so in a sense, we keep our cup separate, but contribute in some sense to both, and without consuming just one together, which I found very fascinating. And I really like the idea of the alone with the alone, because it really captivates what this means.
Or consuming each other.
From a metaphor that I stumbled across in someone else's YouTube video, a man and a woman by the sort of name OG Rose, they give the metaphor of, does someone possess a bird if they're holding the bird by the legs, or does someone own a bird because the bird is sitting on an open palm? Now, if you're holding by the legs, the bird might be possessed by you, but it's on the condition that you are grasping and controlling. Whereas if you're owning the bird because it's sitting on your open palm, the bird may fly away on its own accord and it may come back on its own time, but that's a more authentic expression of a connection. It's willingly sitting on your palm. You know, you're not holding it there. So I think that that's the type of love that you can manifest if you have this alone with the alone relationship.
I can't help thinking.
Maybe it's getting too
though,
deep.
No, but I can't help thinking that to get there, we have to tumble. Like, I don't think we can, like, we actually have to suffer, and neurotic suffering, like, you know, become ridiculous, but crazy. That's lifetime of experience. I don't think we can do it intellectually. I think it's got to be kind of emotional, but yeah, I think this idea of actually, you know, in a way, to be able to be the platform for the bird to sit on, we get there because we realize that we've tried to hang on before and the bird just kind of flies away. So we have to then open our hands. So we grasp first. We realize how useless grasping is, and how much we suffer, how much other people suffer. Things break up. 1 and 2 marriages breaks up, you know. And then after the fact, we go, okay, that doesn't work. Something else might.
I just say that my life experience has also led me to, well, at least my path has been the same as yours, maybe in a more condensed period of time. But certainly I've had the experience where the grasping is something that we think we need to do to get love, but this is, of course, a neurotic fixation, and we quickly find how this is how we stumble upon impotence. This is how we stumble upon castration, because we think that we can get to the Garden of Eden, so-called, or the perfect harmony through our own sort of ego's image. And I think that this is really to be the person who can love with the open palm is someone who has really matured through suffering. And so in that sense, like, again, I always spontaneously had a dislike of Buddhism, not because I'm actually against Buddhism, but because there's a way in which, yes, life is suffering, but there's a way in which desire is not totally futile as a process, because desire as a process brings you in some sense to, I think, a deeper understanding of love. And I think that that's at least what I found very attractive in the philosophy of Osho, because Osho tried to bring together Buddha and Jesus in some sense, or bring together what he called awareness and love, which is like, you don't just withdraw from the world, but you withdraw from the world in order to come back to the world with a deeper love, a more real, you know, like Jesus says, I come with the sword, you know, like it's not, it's, you know, coming with the sword is very different than, you know, just withdrawing from the world and the illusion of appearances. It's kind of like a redoubling of appearance. But we stumble upon the deepest, we stumble upon the deepest metaphysical notions here. Chitan, go ahead.
I just wanted to start a new topic. So complete yourself. Please go ahead.
I have something on that topic. I wanted, before you do that, if possible.
Let's see. Let me just check with Kant about the conditions of possibility for this. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Cadell, you brought up the notion of the sexual non-relation, and I wondered if you might elaborate on that, specifically in terms of this notion of the one in Lacan, which is so difficult to understand. But you mentioned it, and I wanted you to just maybe elaborate on it, but I wanted to bring up or read a little quote from Seminar 19, where he says, there is no second sex. From the moment language starts functioning, there is no second sex. Or to put it differently, concerning what is called heterosexuality, the word heteros, which is the term in the Greek that is used to say other. And so, you know, he uses this term, he kind of plays with the term heterosexual and homosexual. And he says that really sexuality is homosexual in the sense of both the same homo, but also in the term, in the French word homme, l'homme, the man, that there is no real otherness that we can get to in the sexual relation. So in the sense that all sexuality takes on this kind of masturbatory solitude to kind of bring that back into it. So Skedal, I just was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, so I would point towards the latest video I produced on Death Drive 2 by Alenka Zupancic, which goes into these concepts probably in the most depth that I've confronted them personally. The first is that, and this is my own interpretation, right? I'm not sure if I'm 100% correct, but from what I understand, is that in Lacan, the real is the location of the negative one, or the sort of the missing signifier. So the missing signifier is the place of the other, which is basically, if it were present, it would be the other in like the strong sense, like God or the Garden of Eden, or like the utopia. Like this manifests in many different metaphysical systems. It's like the other that would be like the perfect reality. But it's like kind of the absence of the perfect reality is the location of the other, then that's the negative one. And so in Alenka's description of Death Drive, she talks about the signifier one. So the signifier one, that's on the level of the symbolic. So it's kind of like, if like to put it in like the conversation we've been having, it's like by going through suffering, by going through the sort of coming to terms with the negative one, coming to terms with the real, one is capable of sort of constructing, I don't know if that's the right word, or manifesting the signifier one, which would be like basically, if I think about like a realized individual, like David was mentioning earlier about the symbolic and the real and like enlightenment, I would say like someone like Osho or someone like Krishnamurti or someone like just like a realized person. It doesn't have to be, could be any realized individual throughout history would be like a signifier one, where they're kind of like the embodiment of the one, but there's multiple ones. I don't know. I mean, that's sort of my interpretation.
One way to think about it, isn't it? If I remember Zupancic, I read it long time back. But the problem actually is that one is never one in Zupancic. One is always less than one in that sense, you know. And because there's less than one, thus you have two. That's one way to, you know, that it's not zero. It's never zero. It's always minus one. Thus it always becomes two in that sense. And when you think about that problem from that particular sort of entry point of -1 and not zero in that sense, then you may get some very interesting ways to think about this issue that I think Eric is trying to raise in that sense of home or homo, or, you know, the problem of one in love and in romance and so on and so forth. Because even when you actually are approaching the other in that sense, the other actually never remains something which can give you that unity or that completion on the outside. What it can do, or what possibility it has, is it can make you confront your own gap within yourself. It can give you a certain relationship back with your own -1. Because if you actually could fill that -1 completely, you wouldn't need this universe or this relationship anyway. You would have a perfect universe in which you could have, you know, the perfect correlations or whatever existing. The problem with -1 is that what the other can at best give you is a certain relationship back with your own lack, and you move on from there. And, you know,
which means if you do have that relationship with your own lack, if you do have that relationship with your own gap, then many interesting relational possibilities can exist. but what prevents the emergence in some sense of interesting relationships, like I can't help but think about the difference in relational capacity between children versus adults. Whereas adults often become very constrained and very limited, almost because they have a weird neurotic relationship with an image of the perfect one. And that's a consequence of going through the genital maturation process. I think it's a consequence of feeling extremely vulnerable with this energy.
One thing you love about kids, just to say it on, continue from there, is that with kids, they can actually keep on making up rules as they go along.
Yes.
They play the non-all game in that sense.
Yeah.
As adults, for us, it's very difficult to engage with the non-all in that sense. We cannot create rules in that manner. We need certain universal rules through which we have exceptions. And that is how we can engage with that structure. And of course, when one can think about this problem of rules through Wittgenstein, for example, where he's sort of trying to argue, which is there in, I think, Lacan also, in Seminar 11 somewhere, we're discussing this issue of causation. And he's saying that if you always have a certain causal relationship, then you don't need rules. Rules actually come into a certain existence when you have a non-causal relationship, when you do not have a pre-existing cause over there already in place through which you have to structure with the other. When there's a point of non-relation, as we call it, in that sense, it is at the point of non-relation that you start creating rules in that manner, and there's something to think about over there. I'm just sort of raising it.
That's very interesting to think about, especially when the theme in a lot of Lacanian circles right now is this, or like at least what someone like Ishik always talks about on his blog, Zizek Analysis, is this authorization crisis. It's almost like the problem of rules, the problem of authorization. Where do we get our authority from? And I think it's this emergence of the reality of the non-all, the reality of, we have to actually develop relationships. You have to have really, Sandra, did you want to go next?
Yes, I wanted to ask if what you said earlier, Cadell, about this the thing about the tics and the real trying to manifest itself through the body, is that what we could call the feminine jouissance? And okay, so about yes, about this thing about masturbation, the onanism. I felt like wanting to speak about my own experience also. It came up very early in life. Well, I was a child, and it actually came because I had chickenpox. So I remember that I felt like this tingling, and then I had to, like, when you have itch, you scratch, and then suddenly I experienced an orgasm. But then, and then this was all very weird, of course, but then to just continue. But then suddenly my mom comes in and finds what I'm doing, and then it's just wrong, right? You cannot do it. And then it's just, and then comes guilt, of course, right? And then just there's a reason, and then she said, I remember she's saying, you can't just go out there and just be masturbating. And then there was this incoherent, well, I see it's now incoherent, right? A little bit way of saying, you can't just go out there and just be touching you. And I'm not going out there, I'm right here, right? So there's that, I don't know, that's what I was saying. And, but yeah, so there's, and then, well, the implications about just when we grow up and then we see, okay, yeah, we're in society, the sexual, we do not know what to do with it. We do not know what to do with orgasms, and just let's leave it at the private. So then I was also thinking about the practices of onanism with the other, right? And it just with the physical presence of the other, right? And is that not also a form of like a sexual way of dealing with the non-report? And yes, it's also, I mean, as all human actions, we don't know if it's okay or if it's not. We cannot say that it is okay or that it is not if we are to be analysts, right? And then yes, so it is a question of health and letting the other explore. Like, how are you going to be free if you do not, free in a sense, right? If you do not practice freedom yourself, right? And yes, the question about solitude and learning to be with oneself in order to be able to love the other. And it's about sharing solitudes, like Javier puts it. And then I don't think, yes, there is no not doing anything about this. It's like you cannot be not doing anything, right? I mean, even if you're thinking, even if you're in vita contemplativa, as Aaron would put it, there is also praxis, right? And there is also the necessity will come in, and then you will have to stand up, and then you will have it will just continue, right? It was a little bit what I was thinking.
Lots of thoughts there. Did anyone in particular want to respond to anything there? Otherwise I can sort of go for it. I liked your so when you were describing the relationship with your mom, discovering you masturbating and saying it's wrong, did the feeling of guilt happen before your mom, or was it on contact with your mom? Was it the social pressure that created the guilt? Or did the guilt exist before? Because for me, like, I remember the first time I masturbated, I had this idea in my head, no one caught me, but I had this idea in my head already that I shouldn't tell anyone. You know, like, I had this idea that I should keep it to myself. So like, I'm just trying to get at what, like, the origin of the guilt, because in the first paper that this was a huge sort of, the Analytic Society said they were indeterminate on the origin of guilt, you know, whether it was socially caused, whether it's a cause of the personality of the individual. I don't know.
It came because of because of the intervention of my mother. Because yes, I mean, as a child, how could I know that it is wrong, right? And I mean, it just it was by myself, but I or at least I do not know, because I was very young. If, like I said, if I should just keep it to myself and not talk about it, which also, yeah, this brought me another thing I was, I don't know, that doesn't have to do, but I'd say it came because there was an intervening signifier.
Yeah. That's interesting.
But Sandra, do you wonder, as children, this has happened to me also at some level. Do you wonder that why does it happen that this kind of enjoyment as a child always happens when you're alone? Your first time, for some reason, is always, you know, we might say the other intervened after that point, but for some reason, when we are actually enjoying ourselves that way, our initiatory phase actually is alone. It's only then the other intrudes in that sense. So we are also conscious at what point we are alone in that sense. We won't start enjoying with ourselves in that manner while we are in the presence of the other intruding already in that sense. And which is why, you know, one of the injunctions, guilt is not simply this idea of stopping somebody from enjoying. Guilt is actually an injunction for enjoyment also. Guilt is a command for enjoyment also. Enjoy, but enjoy in this way or this condition or this How do we think about it? And I wanted to raise the question
can-
for Marigo here also, but maybe we can get into it, later on.
I think that's a good reversal, Chetan, of this. You can feel guilty for not enjoying. Like that's also an injunction. Yeah, but it seemed, yeah, maybe it is that relationship with the other.
Yeah, something.
I think that I think we could say with Lacan that the other is always there, even before the intrusion. We emerge into the field of the other, right? So even before you're caught by the other, so to speak, when you're alone, you're not alone because the others are always there. And so even if you're masturbating and you feel this sense of guilt, it's because the other, the big other, in terms of the symbolic, our relationship to sexuality is already it's already there preceding us, and I think we emerge into that. So I don't really think that there is a situation where we could say that we are truly alone.
Eric, yeah, please, Sandra, go ahead.
Yes, there is a harassment of the other, I would say, because we do have to remember that it is language and that it is images, right? And that in a sense it's not there, so it's also an illusion. But then yes, guilt is this I would say, the intrusion of language again, right? To that. And the images. And this reminds me of Agamben. In his, there's a small essay called Nymphs on Abby Warburg's work. So yes, it is a relationship with, I would say that sexuality is a relationship, has to do with humans dealing with their images, right? With representations. I would add that.
It's like how humans are trying to represent the real or image the real.
Yes.
Yeah, and there were a few other points you brought up that like particularly I want to emphasize the first point you were bringing up about the real and feminine jouissance. Of course, in Lacan's later seminars, he's trying to zero in on feminine jouissance, and I have some ideas about feminine jouissance as this sort of kind of like the location of the non-relationship itself, like that somehow somehow feminine sexuality is closer to the other than the man. Like where in what I was talking about previously about Zupancic, and this model comes from Zupancic, What is Sex, is that the real is the negative one, and then there's the emergence of the signifier one. I almost feel like in order for the woman to fully experience the mystery of feminine jouissance, she has to be contained within a signifier one, but somehow always outside a signifier one. In other words, it's kind of like, it's really weird. I've seen this in so many marriages and relationships where like the woman accepts submission to a man's symbolic, but is always outside of it while inside of it. Like it's somehow like okay, I'm inside your symbolic, but I'm still more powerful than you within your symbolic. Like I disturb you within your symbolic or something like that. But like if that makes sense.
Not more powerful, just powerful as like, I don't know, because there is like this tendency to think in also in feminism, right? Why women, like I was questioned this in epistemology when I wrote a little bit of feminism in epistemology, and I was like, I mean, what can women, but then it's also about minorities, right? To like exclusion. It's not that they're better. It's not that they're more powerful. It's just that they are other, and hence they can, let's say, add something, right? They can add something to the continuing signifying chain. So I was just wanted to clarify.
I'm really
Read it.
Kind
go
of
ahead,
like,
finish on.
yeah, go ahead, Javier.
Well, what I was going to say is like I'm really fascinated with this. When you said the woman is closer to the other, I found this fascinating because like I always like using these narratives that we have passed on religiously, right? Like Mary and Jesus, right? Mary giving birth to Jesus without having another person, right? This kind of virgin conception, which I find really interesting in itself. And like I almost want to really look at this and study it now because it's like it's really interesting where Mary is like threatened and by society completely, right? Because they don't believe her. They don't believe that she could conceive of the other without a physical other, which I feel like there's something there to really explore, and in the sense of like it's almost very symbolic of how women feel today with societal pressures, right? And their own sexuality. And then the other idea is how the other is this kind of lack, right? Where it's always near you. There's a verse in the Quran, which reminds me where it says, I am closer to you than your own jugular vein, right? So this is very symbolic of how close the other is. And that when we look at religious verses like to know me is to know yourself, right? To go through puberty and everything, this is your first enactment, first exploration of to know the other, but at the same time knowing yourself. And it's a very weird, I think it's a kind of a shock in some sense, because you don't realize what you're doing until someone points it out to you, in some sense, where the unconscious comes conscious. But I thought these are just points that I found interesting in the whole course of the conversation to express here.
But it is interesting to think about this problem. In what way is the feminine closer to the real? It's a very difficult thing to actually get your head around. At least for me, whenever I read that portion, even in the Panchik, it comes up in Lagan. And one way to sort of one thing that always strikes me over there is that whatever whatever the conceptions of male and female we can have, and we can essentialize it, we may not essentialize it. The problem that happens in this kind of thinking is it goes back to our discussion on rules actually in some way. The problem that happens is no matter how you want to universalize a rule, or howsoever you want to universalize a relationship between self and the other in that sense, the problem that you always find is that there always emerges a rule which cannot be totalized over a system, which cannot be universalized over a system, which actually exists only in its particularity. And it is in that particularity that you have to link this relationship between feminine and the real, because without that point of affirmation of the particular in that sense, a rule which cannot be universalized, a rule which cannot be totalized over a system in that sense, you cannot actually articulate this relationship. Else you will always slip into, and you can look at global politics, or the globalization as the word actually emerges from this slippage from the particular directly to the universal in that sense. With the minute you try and do that, you will always find some kind of violence to emerge. I don't know. I'm just sort of putting something out there which I think myself. I would like to hear your thoughts on it.
You were going to say something. Yes, Cadell.
Yeah, well, I would just on that point of the relationship between the universal and the particular, and how it might relate to our conversation on feminine jouissance and the other, is that like there's this stereotype, and a kind, not trying to essentialize, but there's this stereotype where sort of like the masculine position is always stereotyped as this universal generalizer, and where the feminine position is always this particular singularity which escapes any general universal notion, which is kind of like how I was trying to articulate how I've seen sort of like man and woman operate in marriages or long-term relationships, where the man, no matter what sort of structure or let's say, no matter what patriarchal structure exists, There's a way in which woman is always this particular singularity, this otherness, and this doesn't have to be essentialized onto the body of a woman, by the way. I'm just trying to articulate a relationship between masculine and feminine energy. This same relationship could appear between a lesbian couple. This same relationship could exist between a gay couple. I'm trying to articulate a relationship where any universal symbolic function will escape totalization in particularity, in contingency. Basically there's no God, like there's no God in the traditional sense. There's no yeah. So that's as best I can articulate it. So we've gone pretty deep. I've really enjoyed this discussion a lot, and we've really touched on a lot of cool metaphysical ideas. I will sort of approach here summarizing the two papers, unless there's another point that someone really would like to make in relationship to how our conversation has evolved. Feel free to speak now. Okay. So that was 2 hours, a pretty deep dive. So we first discussed two papers from 1912 by Freud. One was a contribution to a discussion on masturbation, which is basically Freud's summary of a psychoanalytic conference on masturbation, where he goes through some of the areas where the Psychoanalytic Society at the time had identified the key aspects of masturbation to be in relationship to a fantasy and to a feeling of guilt. He also goes on to articulate the relationship between masturbation and the emergence of the neuroses, and sort of the position of masturbation as it relates to the emergence of a civilized persona and the cultivation of virtues. In the second paper, we discussed a note on the unconscious in psychoanalysis, which I think is a very interesting and important paper where Freud, to me, gives the clearest articulation of the unconscious as an absent conception, which still exerts a psychological active force on the subject, even if the subject is unaware of it. And he goes on to say that that is the key idea of psychoanalysis as it relates to the formation of neuroses. Basically, you want to think about day-to-day impulses which are impressing themselves upon you, but you may not know the reason why you're acting that way. So the making the unconscious conscious, at least on the psychological level, comes to understanding these absent conceptions or images. And he ends that paper by describing dreams and the mechanism by which latent conception becomes manifest, and the function of the unconscious as it relates to the unconscious censor, as the royal road to the unconscious, so to speak, because the censor is reduced in your dreams. So that I'd say is a summary of the two papers. And again, for the last about hour and a half, we've been discussing some pretty interesting metaphysical ideas related to those two papers, a lot of Lacanian concepts, and the relationship between the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. So thank you all for your time and attention and participation. This has been really, really a good time. And for anyone watching on YouTube later on, these are workshops which will be ongoing, exploring the original Freudian papers, released every 2 weeks, and I will put out a notification in about a week and a half or a week for the next workshop. And I hope all of you have a great day. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Kada.
Bye.